Dr. Nousala. Dr. Nousala is a researcher in sustainable design. Is it Aalto?
Aalto University.
Aalto University in Finland, and a research fellow at the Australian Centre for Governance and Management of Urban Transport, Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. And she was a research fellow at the Spatial Information Architectural Lab at Royal Melbourne Institute of Design and Social Context and the School of Architecture and Design at Royal Melbourne Institute. She earned her PhD at Aerospace Mechanical and Manufacturing Engineering at Royal Melbourne Institute University, and that's in Melbourne, Australia.
That's right. Thank you so much for that. And yes, this topic, this actual idea came up because a lot of my PhD cohort that I'm working with this year kept saying, you know, this knowledge issue, this is it's always the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? And this kept coming up again and again in conversation. Oh, it's the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? And I thought, well, yeah, that might be a good place to start this year's conversation about the work that I've been doing. This actually is an overarching view of probably 10 years of work, working approximately with 100 SMEs, small medium enterprise companies, in relation to larger companies that they've been working with, and how that all works, and the investigations of knowledge networks through comparative analysis case studies. So this is what I've been actually working on for approximately around 8 years or so, pressing on to 9. So it's kind of depressing when you think how long it's, all that work. Yes, let's not talk about how long it really is, but yes, that's and so in terms of longitudinal work, it's actually very valuable because you can actually see how in time, how things evolve, what's the comparative aspect of it, somehow lends itself to developing an idea of measurement in a qualitative sense. So looking at the complexity issues, and in complexity I mean as in like systems within systems, interrelationships with looking at different nodes of networks and information. It seems to be continuous increasing, but really it may be that we're becoming much more aware. And if we look at the previous, was it yesterday, Professor Muller was talking about Science 2, Mode 3, and looking at systems of systems, communities of communities, and we're looking at these types of things. So in fact, this is where this work predominantly sits. And knowledge, scale, social arrangements, industrial, social projects, collaboration, environments, and regulation standards. And just, if you look at all of these things, they're all interrelated. They all have relationships. And from a complex systems point of view, it's multi-layered and it has scales. So it's a non-linear concept and approach. In terms of environment is not just your physical environment, it's all the contextual environments in which these ideas sit and where not just ideas, but actually the networks and exchange happen. So the growth of knowledge. Interdisciplinary, connecting with other connections, and that's qualitative, quantitative. Is the information reliable? It's building up. It is an enormous amount of technical base. But what's important here, in fact, is the knowledge bases. Knowledge bases meaning people. People's knowledge is live. I need to clarify here that we're looking at the difference between knowledge, as in what people do, how they exchange their experiences, as opposed to information databases. So there is a distinct difference between those two, and they often get they get exchanged, but they're not the same thing at all. So, and knowledge, the word knowledge is often, it's one of those ones that, look, in terms of definition, it really is dependent upon where you are looking and what domain you're using it in. And so in this context, in terms of social complex adaptive systems, we're really looking at it as a living system. Knowledge is a living system, something you can't pin down. So if you keep that in mind, this may make more sense to you. So knowledge as the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, explicit knowledge, underneath all that physical databases and codified information and computer and, in fact, presentations and anything that you can actually start putting your hand on and looking at, this is actually, computer systems, all the infrastructure within companies, physical networks. Underneath all of that is the tacit and implicit, with a very vast network of integrated systems between people, which you cannot actually codify. because it's a cyclical arrangement. It keeps going on and on. It's condensed experience. So if we're looking to clarify, to look at tacit knowledge networks, it's our experience or a combination of expertise which is highly condensed, and people call on that when they're trying to clarify between the two of them, or a group of people, or entire companies between each other. They're trying to clarify their position and understanding of what they know and what they don't know. So collaborative, knowledge is, what we know without combining the individual combinations, but you've got individuals and you've got collaboration between all sorts of levels, and the emergence of all of that. So they're kind of like the four aspects of it, very simply, but it doesn't obviously happen in a linear manner like that. Hidden knowledge, part one, really we're looking at the identification and exchange. So we're looking at trying to identify and understand where the development and the approaches, and that really goes back to relationships between what people know and how they interact with their physical documentation, their physical databases, their physical surroundings. So you get two people with exactly the same type of training, give them exactly the same sets of data, access to the same types of electronic libraries or what have you, and you will get different results because the people themselves have got their own personal networks which they call upon in order to create their own networks, and this is scalable. So looking at the exchange, that's actually influenced by the same types of supportive collaborative environments that they've got. So this is actually the elements of how the information turns into knowledge with exchange of people, and how that knowledge then emerges to the next level. Looking at the second part of it, of hidden knowledge, the complex systems, collaboration with respect to the tension between the socio-political, socio-technical, these are all within the physical system. Now I'm talking about, and because it's scalable, we're talking about anything between a working group, a company, a group of companies, a community, a city, and on it goes. So, as you can see, neither must dominate. You need an understanding of the social and the technical, which, by the way, is happening anyway, regardless of whether you're aware of the implicit and tacit networks. These are happening whether you are aware of them or not. So to be, if you're not really focusing on them, then you actually are not really understanding the full bottom part of the iceberg. So looking at tacit knowledge exchange, you have, it really starts with individuals, obviously because, we are people, and if you have systems or networks of companies, this is all about people. So it starts with people. And they have informal networks, and informal networks are extremely powerful. And understanding this transfer, you need an understanding of how this might actually occur. Peer-to-peer interaction. But within peer-to-peer interaction, there also are networks of each individual has their own supportive networks that they've built up through their careers, personally, what have you. When you interact with these different networks, this is where you actually build up an entire set of interactions that then can support the company in a sustainable manner. So looking at these phenomena, because over the years there has been a lot of work in terms of identifying this. In the early days, it was really, a lot of the work was done within knowledge management, which is a terrible time. Managing knowledge, it's just ridiculous, but it seems to be what we're stuck with. And looking at the recommended approach, it's really actually having an understanding as to what the phenomena is doing and seeing and observing that again and again and again. And a really good way of describing it is when Professor Muller said that there's, he's codified the sciences in Science 2, Mode 2, and Mode 3. The transition between there is actually quite important and interesting to understand because, in fact, that's actually where this work has gone. A lot of the, it's not just explicit and exchanging, but when you start looking at systems upon systems, then you can start to understand from a complexity point of view the different layers involved. So this also includes internally, individually, internally, and then within the company, externally and beyond. So in terms of the case histories, as I mentioned before, there was approximately 100 SMEs or so within an organisation over a period of time that we looked at. And small, medium enterprises, they were kind of chosen because they are really dynamic in terms of the size and what they're capable of and how the information was moved around. So it was really easy to actually identify and work with. So these companies ranged anywhere between 1 to 2 people up to 50 or more. So what was interesting to understand over a period of time is what was going on internally and what were these enabling factors. These are factors that actually kept coming up again and again and again internally from the knowledge networks, people's personal networks and how they were interacting with their physical networks, and looking at the conditions in which those things thrived and when they didn't. So the second part of the case study in terms of, and this all happened simultaneously, but I'm just breaking it down for you. The larger companies that those small companies interacted with, you began to see an entire network of small, medium, larger companies, the interaction between the larger companies and the smaller companies and their surrounding cities that they worked within and the influence that they had within their regions. So that's why the comment about the different granularities, the technical and the management staff, and in terms of actually looking at this information, the people involved that we worked with and analysed their work and approaches, it was everybody from the ground up. So you had staff on the ground right up to managerial and back down again. So, yeah. So formal knowledge. So the formal knowledge development and the management activities were very much a part of the work. So you would go in and see what formalised arrangements that are already put in place and then start to unpack and unweave all the tacit networks that were actually related to those formal networks that were codified and well documented, and how much of the tacit networks hung off those processes and how much did they influence and impact them. So the identification and supporting conditions of those practices was quite important. So the sustainability of knowledge exchange 1, this is just the first part of the talking about the knowledge sustainability concept, is that if you actually, those companies that actually could work and understand and took on those kinds of ideas and concepts of creating sustainable environments within the context of what they were doing and working, actually managed to solve some major problems for their companies, and they went on beyond just the 12 months or 24 months. These problems were solved longitudinally, and this is because they became aware and understood the actual structures and what the networks of people within their own organisations were doing and what impact and power those networks had beyond their own company boundaries of rationality into the external wider world of the cities and supply chains and other companies that they were interacting with. So they suddenly became aware of the fact that, yes, they might be small, medium enterprise, they work with much, much larger companies. What is the impact from them going out and the big impact of the large companies coming back to the smaller SMEs? So it was quite a rich environment in terms of wanting to investigate, you know, the knowledge networks and the complexity involved, which is why that select group was chosen in the first place. Going on with the sustainability outputs, the maintaining and the process of maintaining the equilibrium is really crucial because, in fact, that's actually maintaining sustainability and avoiding entropy of the companies involved. And, you know, I don't know if any of you know the statistics of small, medium enterprise in Southeast Asia and Australasian regions it's 5 years. It's pretty standard, you know, over the world that you have approximately 5 years to get stabilised or you perish. So micro business and small, medium enterprise actually make up a very, very large part of GDP in many parts of the world. So it's actually quite an important aspect. But they're very hard to pin down and nail and understand what is actually going on for them and how to create sustainability. A lot of governments want to know how to do this because they want to create or somehow stimulate wonderful sort of areas of growth in terms of industry clustering, like the likes of well, Silicon Valley here, but in other parts of the world, the idea of pulling people together within a region to create the dynamics of actually building industry clusters. And the building blocks for that, in fact, are SMEs and the dynamics that occur between them. But it's still it is no silver bullet. There is no one way of actually doing it. It's a multiple. There's a multiple factors involved in order to do that. So, looking at the knowledge transference, and the thing is that it's very difficult, and it seems to be something that's not valued within companies, yet it can actually make or break them. In terms of, it's always been there, we don't really need to understand why the people work the way they do. But in fact, if you have an understanding of churn rate, for example, in large companies or even smaller ones for that matter, if you actually break up those knowledge networks too readily and on a regular basis, people lose track of their own personal networks, the way in which they work. They lose track of the way in which they interact with their day-to-day tools and sets of knowledge, and they no longer have access to all of those familiar things that actually they have built up over a period of time. So if you actually start moving people around, you actually naturally break a lot of the knowledge networks that people have built up, and they have to re-establish all of that, and that takes time. And that is part of the process of when people are actually building up their networks and they're actually creating those networks within their own organisations, between themselves and other organisations, they have an integration process. And when you start pulling that all apart because you're actually physically moving people, or you're changing the way in which they work, you're creating the possibility of disintegration. So there seems to be a point whereby a group that have worked together as a community of practice, who have come from a community interest, and they've actually built up over time enough practice between themselves to be quite solid and sustainable, and they can keep going and maintain their ideas and their ways of working. There is robustness in there, but there is a point of entropy that if you actually disengage those people to a certain degree, you will introduce disintegration. So that's really why it should be viewed as critical. And in the world, and generally speaking, most companies, most entities, most organisations, most governments, most local governments, all of these entities are really knowledge-rich these days. There's virtually no one who's not. So it seems to be counterintuitive to actually not take into consideration the way in which all of these structures are working. And they are structures in their own right. They're closely related to physical structures, and you can't separate the two. And in fact, if you try to pull away, if you try and ignore or in some way disempower the tacit networks or play them down, the further away they get from the physical, the harder it is for the people to integrate the physical to what they know. And you stretch that long enough, you will make a disintegration, and you will actually break that. So it seems to be, over a period of time, and this is all in the paper, and there's a much more theory and technical aspects within the paper that I've put in for this in the afternoon session, so it's really not relevant to kind of go and drill down into all of that. But in fact, if you actually have a way in which you can understand that integration and the tacit knowledge networks are quite closely related. They won't actually ever be at the same time, but they'll be influencing each other. So those networks and those companies that understand their tacit networks and processes and people and what they're doing and enhance them, they're quite close to their physical, and so that's actually quite healthy. And the dynamics that they'll be able to actually maintain and actually be able to respond much more quickly. Those companies who are actually disadvantaging their staff in terms of being able to keep them up with their tacit networks and connections, they actually extend to a point where they actually break it. So there's an actual spatial relationship between the tacit structures and the physical structures in terms of sustainability and health of the company. So what needs to be done? Implementation is, I also don't like implementation, but you need to introduce the methodological approaches between complex organisations, you need to understand what's going on. First of all, you need to identify it and be just aware of it, which is what I said earlier. You just really need to be aware of it. And scalability is fundamental to any of the holistic methods. These companies were also working within a region which was quite depressed. So in actual fact, we went on to work with government and to understand the local government situation and policy applications that could eventuate out of the work here, and show them that these companies had a specific requirement. This is how they were working over a period of time. So that information was scalable in that sense, for example. So it's important to understand the different scales in a system so that you can scope and understand what the vulnerabilities may be. So what needs to be done? So we need the crucial integration of the basic holistic methodologies. These are human-based systems and patterns of interaction. This is what we're talking about, tacit knowledge networks. Companies are people, and cities and societies are people, and people have social-based systems which actually have vast impacts. So we really need to have effective tools and understanding in terms of communication, understanding the technical interaction between that, and need to combine many areas of support. And as we're looking at Science 2 Mode 3, systems within systems and communities within communities, we need to understand how the socio-technical systems can bring together those practices and actually enhance the sustainability of those physical structures and those physical companies. And understanding the purposes of constraint, really comprehending that, in fact, constraint does not mean positive or negative, it's simply an impact, and understanding how that is going to impact that and what scale are you working on. So understanding the interaction is also just as relevant for the formal, and it needs to happen simultaneously. It's really understanding the complex issues of this is really understanding the way in which we're trained and how we're thinking. There isn't a great deal of training and understanding at the moment. This is all emerging in terms of education. Looking at, for example, engineering schools, they are now struggling with the fact that they are highly well trained in specific areas, but engineering processes are actually highly complex these days, stretching over vast domains. Now, we need to prepare people for the different areas in which this could impact. Just an aside, most of those companies were in manufacturing engineering companies. So, in fact, we are looking at really siloed processes and siloed training in a world that is actually non-linear, highly complex, and covers many domains. So how are we going to approach this in terms of training and learning and all of these aspects? And it's true that it's great to have all the technical abilities, but we also need to be able to apply it in the field. We need to be able to somehow integrate it into the field, understand what's happening, what are the feedback loops, how are we going to get the information back to understand whether or not this is actually working, or actually are we making it much more difficult or breaking something down. So going on with the method, this is actually just basic, very generally the process. We're selecting several case studies, and like I said, the structure was about 100 SMEs, but they were in relation to other larger companies over a period of time. Just towards the end, we did actually talk to and work with local government in terms of understanding that, in fact, it's interesting, you cannot have a kind of a pilot project. This is going back to the wicked problem question. That, in fact, that you can't, having a pilot project going into policy and applying something that impacts a manufacturing region, for example, it's never really a pilot. It's live. When you put something into action, it's live. It cannot really be a pilot. So it's better to understand and have an understanding of where you've come from in terms of the different possibilities of the actual players involved. And longitudinal range actually helps you do that. It's really good to be prepared. Overnight success, 10 years of preparation. So the knowledge exchange point, this is just an example of the impact with one of the larger manufacturing companies within that region. And as you can see, there's 3 different groups working in there, working separately within the large company, the new product development, the sustainable people, and the economic people. And they had an innovation point there. And they were all small teams. They had enough people to actually operate as small, medium enterprise companies within their own right, and sometimes in different regions, but they're in the same company. So over time, the constraints was the product timeline, and external constraints was government regulations that required them to do that work in a particular way. All the regulations, many, many regulations. So there's a period of time, and then the final second point, which occurs at project completion. Those two dark points, by the way, is where the translation of innovation and the idea of where you could actually start integrating with other companies within your region to possibly create clusters and information, the actual information and knowledge that will go on to create other companies who want to work in this area. They're almost like innovation points for clusters in that particular region. Some companies span out of those dark black points there, and they went on to develop specific new ideas within that region and cluster over a 10-year period. However, at the second, there's 2 points generally, but this is just representation. This can be scaled up or down, and you can have multiple layers of this. But just representationally speaking, the second one is pretty much where the product's done, it's all done in a linear process, we're finished now, and if you do not actually disseminate that and actually embed it within a knowledge network, a knowledge base of a group of people who are used to working together, who can pass that information on in a meaningful manner, that is actually where you lose the innovation for that company and that region. It's gone. Because in fact they disband, they go on to the next project, and it's a linear process, it's not circular, and that's it, it's finished. So there is a period of time. And so that's part of the consequences in terms of understanding how those relationships work in terms of levels and scales and granular processes, individuals and organisations, and the external environment contextually and beyond that. And beyond, in this point I was making was, in fact, the possibility of creating industry clusters that then go on to create hubs like Silicon Valley or something like that. So a bit of theory, and so P there, Pn plus 1, so you can have many, Pn plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And that's the circular nature of what I've been talking about. So it's maintaining themselves against entropy. So that contributes to organisational sustainability, the circular effects, and organisational learning cycles are extremely important. They happen continuously, whether you're aware of them or not. They're just happening all the time. That's how the knowledge is cycling and circulating. And that's how you build an organisation. And how am I going for time? 10, 15. Sorry? 10, yeah. Okay. So, yes, so the organisational learning cycles, that's extremely important. So begin and coordinate those learning cycles with the individuals and within the organisations that they're working with, and then extend that into the organisational knowledge. And individual knowledge, again, is very different from organisational knowledge or collective knowledge. Behaves completely differently. So, okay, many models exist in terms of looking at some of these structural networks and the similarities, but what's important is actually having a process whereby you can actually do the comparative analysis over a period of time to see the overall organisational sustainability, how sustainable really is it. So you can't, a lot of this work you cannot measure it in so far as it's not quantitative, it's qualitative, but in fact you can do comparative analysis over a period of time and you can certainly see a pattern that's going on. And that actually can be put into hardcore investment arguments or economic arguments, and which we have done, and it's actually quite effective. But it cannot happen over time, overnight. You have to have a bit of time. And the strange thing, I may have mentioned this before, but in fact, communities of practice which are much more stable, they're practicing communities that have been around for a while. The communities of interest is where it seems to start, but it takes about 3 years for a community of practice to actually become solid and actually be robust enough to continue without too much interference. So the tacit knowledge exchange is what supports the sustainable learning process. I found this useful in terms of talking to people who don't know anything about a lot of this different types of work that we've been talking about, to make the point between process versus practice. you have processes, and there's lots of processes which have been described within a lot of the organisational literature, but also within the companies themselves. They have their own internal documentation as to what all their processes are, their standard operation procedures and all of this. But if you ask them to say, but what does it look like in practice? When you actually put those into practice, what does it look like? How does it behave? That's quite a different question. The ones that's very interesting is routine and spontaneous, which is typically what happens when it's actually live in the field. And I mean by everyday processes and what people do on a day-to-day basis. If there's a process that doesn't work on the ground, on the factory floor, people will find a way in practice to circumnavigate that like water around a rock. They'll just go, yeah, that's the process that's documented, but this is actually what we do in practice. And that happened quite a lot. That was, in fact, some of the management were quite surprised when they found little hidden books and things in the factory and of what they actually did to get the job done as opposed to what was recorded in meetings. And so this is something that people know about. We all know about it, but we just kind of say, well, that's how people do it. And as long as our bottom line and our, revenue comes in, we're okay. It's kind of not a good idea to ignore that. And in fact, several companies use that, actually ask permission of the workers, may we please have a look at your private, because the workers absolutely viewed this as their private practice documentation. Can we view it and please, integrate it into our, well, you can keep doing it, but can we just know a little bit about it? So there was a bit of a situation where we had to negotiate with management and say to them, well, yes, you can, but you understand that you have to keep their trust, that they're doing their job and they feel like they want to continue doing their job, but you can't be sort of pushing them. You have to allow them, there's got to be an exchange. So this knowledge exchange occurred. And what happened was, instead of the small company becoming, which was hierarchical, the management flattened it to a flat structure. They then plugged themselves into a larger organisation and lived to fight another day for another 5 years because they were looking at closing the doors. So it's actually kind of not a small, trivial, soft, fluffy thing. It's not, actually. It's extremely powerful and very serious part of operations. We were talking about cyclical things and cycles and how knowledge whizzes around in cycles continuously. This is my interpretation, representation, attempt. In the box is what we're going to do in the future. We're going to make it sort of like a hologram that you can sort of go, well, and this is what happens. I kind of like that idea, going up and saying, well, I'll punch in a few things and there you go. And so in terms of dealing with complexity and the communication of it, visual aids and visual ways in which you can express it is very helpful, because on the whole, when you start talking about complexities and different scales of different models, people can only take in so much. So if you have representation, visual representation, it actually helps to describe what complex systems might be doing at any given point. So this is an idea that the dotted square rectangle on the side there, on your left, is really a slice of what people can maybe take in. They can't remember all of those circles, but they'll certainly go through that journey. So that big arrow, fat arrow down the bottom is where all the people come on with their processes, and every time they go around the circle, they exchange and they forget something, they pick something up, and they forget something and they pick something up, and then they keep going. But they keep going up the scale of knowledge, increasing their expertise and their experience, and they keep going up those. So the top is the constraints that you can physically push down in terms of, well, the company's only so big, so it's only got so much money. Bottom is universal principles, community goals, like government regulations. So you've got the sandwich effects, squishing. The company has to work out, or that could be a group of, it could be us in this room. This could be a company, a city. It's scalable. That's the whole idea. So this is what we're going to do in the future. 4-dimensional. See how we go. Lessons learned. There's a few of these. Okay, expert communities of interest behaved quite differently just from the regular communities of interest. experts came together. They didn't know each other very well, but they were willing to actually exchange a few things across some very strange boundaries at times, competitors, things like this. But they were also desperately wanting to seek a particular problem that it was enough of an interest that they kept going. Some of these communities of interest then developed into communities of practice, whereby they're actually still competitors and what have you, but they're willing to come together and discuss these things because it must be solved. It's actually crucial for what they were looking at. So it has to be a burning desire, something that really binds them together to actually pull their interest in, hence the title. It's not just a social science phenomenon. Upward, downward causal effect, well, that would be the previous, whizzing up and down. And working individuals around indicators, small groups and working clusters, larger organisers and collaboration. And the way in which all of that integrates and works in between and beyond. I could put up there a fabulous drawing of all these lines and arrows and how everything goes together, but that really doesn't help. And I was just previously, earlier this week, feels like a year ago, but it was only this week, I was in San Jose at the ISSS Complexity Conference. And in there was someone who was working in Taiwan, and he has spent 20 years actually producing models and diagrams of exactly what I was talking about. And they took up the entire screen, and it was just flooded. It was spectacular. You had to see it to believe it. I mean, it was wonderful, but to make head nor tail out of it, it was effective in terms of, look, that's what it does at any given moment, and that's just a static version. Imagine it being dynamic and moving. So maybe I'll try and construct one day and see how it goes. But yes, that's very ambitious. And I might not live that long. But so lessons too. So the difficulty of implementing these formal knowledge management processes and knowledge networks, because it involves these horizontal activities. For example, very briefly, stovepiping, engineering. I love picking on engineering. They're just so good. I mean, I have to thank them for all the years of knowledge they've given me. So I love picking on the engineering companies. They have really good reasons why a lot of their processes are vertical and actually locked into place. Because they build bridges, they build planes, and we don't want those falling down or them flying, dropping out of the sky and killing people. That's quite a good incentive, really, isn't it, to be very technical orientated and make sure you have those structures in place. However, there are increasing numbers of instances whereby the lack of communication between various different engineering processes has caused a problem. And some of these instances are just purely human network-orientated issues where the tacit knowledge networks broke down because the management had been moving them around. It was cost-effective, but the bottom line was that the people on the ground could no longer get the communication that they had before. There were systems in place that nobody had actually documented. Because, why? Because they didn't know that they knew that. They didn't know what they knew. They could say more what they could write. So this was kind of an example. And the famous one was the Boeing, where the bolts on the windshield were the wrong size because of exactly this type of process. It came back, they did their work, and they found out it was purely a knowledge network issue, communications, and they found it and tracked it back. And the pilot, he survived, but the cockpit window was blown out, and he had to hang on until they landed the plane. So that was quite a famous one. And it's a plane full of people, and you've got one pilot on autopilot, and it's, kind of scary. So these are really serious issues. 3, project-based organisations, just because of these reasons, they have project, which is a project and a process, which has a beginning, a middle, and end. But mixed up with all of that now in these complex projects is we have complexity and we have complications. We have complicated spaghetti processes, which are a combination of old legacies linked together, documentation that doesn't match the other documentations coming. So you've got all these old legacies. And you actually have complex systems involved because of the new types of work that's going on. It's all mixed together. So how do you make sense of all of that? And that this is the interdisciplinary approach and inter-organisational collaboration that you need to actually unpack all of that and see what's going on. I mean, some of the processes, last year, NASA came to speak. Was it last year? That NASA came and spoke here at this conference. And the complexity that's now involved in that, it's so complex that the systems within systems within systems, that the systems themselves knows what they're doing, but maybe the people who actually put it all in there just don't know, because that was a linear process that they went through in order to implement those things. So that's how these processes are now interconnected with complicated processes versus complexity. But they're actually integrated, and they're actually quite, a challenge to deal with. So the idea of preserving implicit and tacit knowledge is actually becoming more important, not less. So the conclusion. As if you could conclude on something like that. I just think, I don't think you can actually. Knowledge is people and organisations and collaborations, and they're interacting with formal and external, sources, and communication is key. And those communications can happen in so many different ways now. Identification of key experiential transition points, like those black points I was talking about, it's interesting if you can actually unpack those to some degree. Certainly the companies, a proportion of some of the companies that we worked with did that very successfully. Not always, by the way. So knowledge spirals happens. That's going to happen no matter what. It's just happening right now. So whether you pay attention to it or not, as a part of the process of creating a sustainable environment in terms of contextual sustainability, is up to the people involved in that company or that region or that entity. What is the risk of not being aware of it? I'll just leave that hanging there. So the future directions. The previous, I looked at the threads that actually feed into the active and the living networks, where the intersections occur. For example, where I was talking about the vertical in terms of the engineering companies, the vertical, and then the knowledge networks, which are horizontal. That's horizontal, right? Yeah. And they come across there like this, and you say, oh, well, that's a problem, that point. But that point is also the solution. So it's kind of interesting to see how those nodes work. They're quite dynamic nodes. Shared experience about being living cognitive complex systems, the living part, the social complex adaptive systems. Science 2, Mode 3. And the historical communications and action. And I'm talking about this because the historical aspects give you the third leg of a stool. It really is the anchor point. You need 3 points in order to actually analyse something. And historical, longitudinal, network, behaviour, actions, all of that give you that third leg of the stool in order to understand where you are now and where you might be going. It's not prediction, because in fact it is dynamic. However, it does give you an understanding of what is happening and actually trying to track that and have somewhere to start and keep going. So at that point, I'll stop and thank you.